Los Angeles International Airport, one of the busiest transportation hubs in the world, was about to face an unexpected challenge. When Olivia Johnson, a talented African-American detective with the California Police, boarded Flight 217 bound for San Francisco, she had no idea of the prejudices that were about to be unleashed. As tensions rose and suspicious glances were directed at her, an apparently ordinary passenger, David Anderson, watched silently from his seat. But Anderson was no ordinary passenger, and his suspicions were about to trigger a series of events that would change the lives of everyone on board. What hidden power could his actions have? And how would one detective's struggle become the catalyst for a profound reflection on racial prejudice and social transformation? Let's find out. But before we dive into this story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you like stories with unexpected twists and moments of justice, don't forget to subscribe. Los Angeles International Airport was buzzing with activity on that hot summer afternoon. Among the crowd of hurried travelers, one figure stood out for her serene and determined bearing. Olivia Johnson, a California police detective, walked purposefully towards the boarding gate for Flight 217 bound for San Francisco. At 35, Olivia was an imposing woman. Her ebony skin contrasted with the pearl grey pantsuit she wore, and her hair, pulled back in a tight bun, accentuated her defined features and penetrating eyes. As she walked, she couldn't help but feel the weight of curious glances following her. She was used to it. Being a black woman in a position of authority always attracted attention, both positive and negative. Upon reaching the boarding gate, Olivia paused for a moment to check her phone. A message from her superior reminded her of the importance of the mission awaiting her in San Francisco. She sighed deeply, storing the device in her bag. After an exhausting week dealing with a complicated case in Los Angeles, all she wanted was a quiet flight to mentally prepare for what was to come. Passengers for Flight 217 to San Francisco, please proceed to boarding, a female voice announced over the loudspeakers. Olivia joined the line of passengers, her mind wandering between the details of her upcoming mission and the yearning for a moment of peace. However, as she advanced through the boarding bridge, an uncomfortable sensation began to grow inside her. It was that intuition she had developed over years of police work, the one that warned her when something didn't fit. As she entered the plane, her eyes quickly scanned the aisle and the faces of the passengers already seated. That's when she saw him, a middle-aged white man who was observing her with unsettling intensity. Their gazes met for an instant, and Olivia felt a chill run down her spine. David Anderson, seated in row 15, couldn't help but tense up when he saw Olivia board the plane. Something about her immediately aroused his suspicions. Perhaps it was the way she scanned the plane upon entering, or maybe the suspicious bulge in her bag. Whatever it was, David was convinced that this woman was hiding something. As Olivia moved down the aisle looking for her seat, David couldn't take his eyes off her. His mind began to work at full speed, imagining increasingly alarming scenarios. What if she was a terrorist or a drug trafficker? The possibilities seemed endless in his head. Olivia found her seat, 22C, and stored her carry-on luggage in the overhead compartment. As she settled in, she couldn't help but notice that the man in row 15 was still watching her. She decided to ignore him, attributing his behavior to simple curiosity or, at worst, to racial prejudice that she was unfortunately accustomed to. The plane began to fill up, and soon the murmur of conversations and the sound of luggage being stowed filled the cabin. Olivia closed her eyes for a moment, trying to relax. "It's just a 1-hour flight," she told herself. "Soon you'll be in San Francisco, focused on your mission." But David Anderson wasn't willing to let the flight pass in peace. Every movement Olivia made, no matter how insignificant, fueled his suspicions. He saw her take a book out of her bag and start reading. But to him, this gesture of normalcy only seemed like a facade to hide her true intentions. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the tension between Olivia and David, though silent, began to grow. She was aware of the glances but determined to ignore them. He was increasingly convinced that something wasn't right. What neither of them knew was that this routine flight was about to become an experience that would change their lives forever. As the plane rose above Los Angeles, It carried with it not only passengers and luggage, but also a growing emotional time bomb that threatened to explode at any moment. Flight 217 had reached its cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign turned off with a soft chime. Passengers began to relax, some taking out books or tablets, others closing their eyes for a brief nap. Everyone except David Anderson. From his seat in row 15, David hadn't stopped observing Olivia for a second. Every gesture, every movement, no matter how minimal, fueled his suspicions. He saw her take out her phone, quickly type something, and put it away again. Who could she be communicating with, he thought, his mind imagining all kinds of conspiracies. Olivia, for her part, was trying to concentrate on the book she had taken out, a detective novel that would normally have completely absorbed her. However, she couldn't help but feel the penetrating gaze of that man. She tried to convince herself that she was exaggerating, that maybe he was just a nervous passenger or someone fascinated for some reason, but years of experience as a detective told her there was something more. She decided to get up to go to the bathroom, an excuse to stretch her legs and, incidentally, better assess the situation. As she passed by David's row, she felt how he visibly tensed. Their gazes met for an instant, and Olivia could see in his eyes a mixture of fear and hostility that disconcerted her. David, for his part, interpreted this movement as a confirmation of his suspicions. She's surveying the terrain, he thought. She must be carrying something in that bag. Unable to contain himself any longer, he leaned towards the passenger seated next to him, a businessman absorbed in his laptop. "Excuse me," David whispered. "Have you noticed anything strange about that woman?" The businessman, surprised by the interruption, looked at David with confusion. "What woman?" he asked. "The black woman who just passed by." "The one in the grey suit," David responded, lowering his voice even more. "I think she's up to something." The businessman looked towards the back of the plane, where Olivia was waiting her turn to enter the bathroom. "I don't see anything weird," he said, returning to his laptop. "She looks like a normal passenger." But David wasn't willing to let it go. "She's been acting suspiciously since she got on the plane. She constantly checks her bag and looks around as if she's watching something." The businessman, now slightly uncomfortable, tried to calm David. "Look, sir, I'm sure it's nothing. Maybe she's just nervous about flying." But the businessman's words only served to convince David that no one else was seeing the obvious. He leaned back in his seat, his mind working at full speed. He had to do something. He had to alert someone. Meanwhile, Olivia returned to her seat, aware that the tension had increased. She could feel how some passengers near David were now looking at her with curiosity, some even with suspicion. She decided it was time to take matters into her own hands. She took out her phone and, making sure no one could see the screen, sent an encrypted message to her superior. "Possible developing situation on the flight, suspicious passenger, will keep you informed." This gesture, which for Olivia was a necessary precaution, was interpreted by David as the definitive confirmation of his fears. He saw how she quickly typed on her phone and then put it away with a movement that seemed furtive to him. "I knew it," he thought, his heart racing. "She's communicating with someone. This is a coordinated operation." David's paranoia began to spread like an oil stain. He started whispering to nearby passengers, discreetly pointing towards Olivia, sowing doubts in their minds. "Oh, have you noticed how that woman is acting?" he murmured. "She keeps checking her bag, and she just sent a suspicious message." Some passengers ignored him, but others began to pay attention, casting furtive glances towards Olivia. The tension on the plane was growing by the moment. Olivia, aware of the whispers and glances, remained apparently calm, but her mind was working at full speed, assessing the situation and considering her options. What had begun as a routine flight was quickly turning into a potentially dangerous situation. Distrust and fear were spreading among the passengers, fueled by David's unfounded suspicions. As the plane continued its journey to San Francisco, the cabin had become a hotbed of silent tension. Olivia knew she had to act soon before the situation spiraled completely out of control, but every move she made could be misinterpreted, further increasing suspicions. Flight 217 had become an emotional powder keg, ready to explode at any moment. and both Olivia and David knew that it would be they who would determine whether the situation was resolved peacefully or erupted into open conflict. Flight 217 had been in the air for 30 minutes when Olivia's phone vibrated in her pocket. She knew it was an important call. Her superior would only contact her mid-flight if it was absolutely necessary. With a barely audible sigh, Olivia got up from her seat and headed towards the back of the plane, seeking a bit of privacy. David Anderson, from his seat, observed every movement with hawk eyes. He saw how Olivia looked around before answering the call, a gesture that for him only confirmed his suspicions. Leaning into the aisle, he tried to catch fragments of the conversation. Olivia, aware of the curious glances, lowered her voice as much as possible. "Yes, sir. I understand the gravity of the situation," she said, her tone professional but tense. "Is there any change in the mission details?" The words mission and gravity floated in the air, catching the attention not only of David, but of several nearby passengers. A murmur of unease began to spread through the cabin. "Understood, sir," Olivia continued, oblivious to the effect her words were having. "I'll be ready to act as soon as we land. I'll keep my eyes open for any unexpected developments." By the time Olivia finished the call and returned to her seat, the damage was already done. Passengers who had overheard fragments of the conversation began to exchange nervous glances and whisper among themselves. David, feeling validated in his suspicions, wasted no time in sharing what he had heard with the passengers around him. "You see," he whispered urgently, "she's talking about a mission. What kind of mission could she have on a commercial flight?" The flight attendant, noticing the growing unrest among the passengers, approached David. "Sir, is there a problem?" she asked with a tense smile. David, seeing an opportunity, responded in a low but firm voice. "That woman," he said, discreetly pointing towards Olivia. "She's been acting suspiciously since she got on the plane, and now I heard her talking about a mission and staying alert. I think she could be dangerous." The flight attendant, trained to handle delicate situations, tried to calm David. "Sir, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. Please try to stay calm. I'll inform the captain about your concerns." But the flight attendant's words only served to convince David that they weren't taking the threat seriously. As he watched her walk away, his frustration and fear grew. He decided that if no one else was going to do something, he would have to take matters into his own hands. Olivia, from her seat, could feel how the atmosphere on the plane had changed. The furtive glances and whispers had increased. She knew that her phone call had been noticed, but she couldn't imagine the degree of paranoia it was generating. She decided it was time to try to dispel the suspicions. Calmly, she got up and headed towards the bathroom, intentionally passing close to David. As she passed by him, she gave him a kind smile. "Excuse me," she said in a voice loud enough for others to hear. "Do you know if it's much longer until we arrive? I have an important meeting in San Francisco." David, surprised by the direct approach, stammered a response. I don't know," he said, his eyes avoiding Olivia's. Olivia nodded with another smile and continued on her way. She hoped this brief interaction with David would have helped dispel some of the suspicions. However, the effect was the opposite. For David, this approach only confirmed his fears. He was convinced that Olivia was trying to cover up her true intentions. Meanwhile, the news of the supposed suspicious passenger had spread throughout the plane like wildfire. Passengers exchanged nervous glances and whispers, creating a palpable atmosphere of tension. A young mother, seated a few rows behind Olivia, clutched her baby to her chest, casting fearful glances towards the detective. A middle-aged executive took out his laptop and began typing frantically, as if he were drafting his will. Even an elderly couple, who until recently had been dozing peacefully, were now wide awake and alert. David, feeling increasingly anxious and frustrated by the apparent lack of action from the crew, decided to take matters into his own hands. He got up from his seat and headed towards the front of the plane, determined to speak directly with the flight staff. "Excuse me," he said in a low but firm voice to one of the flight attendants. "I need to speak with the captain immediately. It's about a threat to the flight's security." The flight attendant, a woman in her 40s with a serene expression, tried to calm David. "Sir, I understand your concern, but I assure you there is no threat on board. We have been informed of your concerns and we are monitoring the situation." But David wasn't satisfied. "You don't understand," he insisted, raising his voice without realizing it. "That woman is dangerous. She's planning something. I can feel it." His outburst attracted the attention of several nearby passengers, who now looked at the scene with a mixture of curiosity and alarm. The tension in the cabin increased notably. Olivia, from her seat, observed the situation with growing concern. As an experienced detective, she knew that high-tension situations could escalate quickly if not handled carefully. She decided it was time to intervene before things got out of control. She got up from her seat and walked with a firm step towards where David was arguing with the flight attendant. As she approached, she could hear fragments of the heated conversation. "Sir, please return to your seat," the flight attendant insisted, maintaining a calm but firm tone. "Not until you do something about that woman," David replied, pointing towards Olivia's seat without realizing she was approaching. "Excuse me," Olivia intervened with a calm but authoritative voice. "Is there a problem I can help with?" David turned abruptly upon hearing her voice, his eyes dilated with surprise and fear. "You!" he exclaimed, taking a step back. "Stay where you are." The flight attendant, sensing that the situation could escalate quickly, stepped between them. "Please, you both need to calm down and return to your seats." But David wasn't willing to give in. "Not until they check her bag," he insisted, pointing at Olivia. "I'm sure she's hiding something." Olivia, maintaining her calm, decided it was time to take control of the situation. "Sir," she said, addressing David, "I understand you're worried. But I assure you there's nothing to fear. I'm a detective with the California police." This revelation caused a murmur of surprise among the passengers observing the scene. David, however, didn't seem convinced. "That's exactly what someone trying to cover something up would say," he exclaimed, his voice trembling with emotion. "I demand that her bag be checked right now." The situation had reached a critical point. Passengers watched with a mixture of fear and fascination, wondering how this conflict would be resolved. The crew found themselves in a delicate position, trying to maintain calm on the flight without alienating any passenger. Olivia knew that her next actions would be crucial. She had to find a way to dispel the suspicions and calm the situation without compromising her mission or her authority as a law enforcement officer. As the tense silence spread through the cabin, Olivia made a decision that would change the course of the flight. The silence in the cabin was so dense, it could almost be cut with a knife. All eyes were fixed on Olivia and David, waiting to see how this tense situation would unfold. Olivia, aware that every second of indecision only increased the passengers' anxiety, took a deep breath and stepped forward. "All right," she said in a clear and firm voice, looking directly at David. "If this is what it takes for everyone to feel safe, I'm willing to cooperate." A murmur of surprise ran through the cabin. No one expected the mysterious woman to yield so easily to David's demands. Olivia turned to the flight attendant. "With your permission, I'd like to make a statement to all the passengers." The flight attendant, somewhat bewildered but relieved that someone seemed to be taking control of the situation, nodded and handed her the microphone from the plane's communication system. "Attention, passengers of Flight 217, Olivia began, her voice resonating throughout the cabin. "My name is Olivia Johnson, and I'm a detective with the California Police. I understand that my behavior and a private phone conversation have caused concern among you." There was absolute silence as everyone listened attentively. "I'm on my way to an important mission in San Francisco, the details of which are confidential. However, I want to assure you that I pose no threat to this flight or to any of you." Olivia paused, her eyes scanning the cabin, meeting the gazes of the passengers. She could see fear, confusion, and in some cases a glimmer of understanding. "I understand that in these times, distrust and fear can lead to misunderstandings. But I also know that as a community, we have the responsibility not to let those fears divide us." David, who had been listening with a mixture of disbelief and confusion, interrupted. "But the call, the encrypted message, explain that." Olivia nodded, grateful for the opportunity to clarify. The call I received was from my superior, informing me about changes to the mission awaiting me in San Francisco. The encrypted message I sent was a standard protocol to confirm that I had received the information. None of this has anything to do with this flight or any of you. Then, in a gesture that surprised everyone, Olivia opened her bag. As you can see, I'm not carrying anything dangerous, just my badge, she said, showing her official identification, some documents related to my work, and personal items. A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. The tension began to visibly dissipate as passengers processed the information. But Olivia wasn't finished. She turned to David, who now seemed to have shrunk into himself, clearly embarrassed. "Sir," she said, her voice softer now, "I understand your concern. In my line of work, I've seen how fear can cloud our judgment, but I've also seen how understanding and empathy can overcome those fears." David, with tears in his eyes, stammered an apology. I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. Olivia raised a hand, stopping his words. "Apologies aren't necessary. What's important is that we learn from this, all of us." She turned once more to the cabin in general. This incident reminds us how easy it is to be carried away by our prejudices and fears, but it also shows us that when we take the time to communicate and understand each other, we can overcome those barriers. Spontaneous applause erupted in the cabin. The passengers, freed from their fear and tension, expressed their relief and approval. "I don't know how to make up for this." Olivia offered him an understanding smile. "Sometimes recognizing our mistakes is the first step to growth. Perhaps this is an opportunity for all of us to reflect on how we see others." As the flight continued its journey to San Francisco, passengers began to chat among themselves, sharing their thoughts on what had happened. The experience had created an unexpected bond between them, a reminder of their shared humanity. Olivia, seated again in her place, reflected on the day's events. Although it wasn't the preparation she had expected for her mission, she felt she had accomplished something equally important. She had transformed a moment of fear and division into an opportunity for understanding and unity. As the plane began its descent towards San Francisco, Olivia knew that this experience would stay with her long after Flight 217 landed. It was a powerful reminder that, even in the most tense moments, understanding and empathy could triumph over fear and suspicion. Flight 217 landed at San Francisco International Airport without further incident. However, the story of what happened on board didn't end with the wheels touching the runway. As passengers disembarked, the buzz of conversations filled the terminal, with many sharing their experience of the flight with friends and family who were waiting for them. Olivia, aware that her mission required discretion, tried to blend in with the crowd and quickly exit the airport. However, as she walked through the terminal, she noticed that several passengers were pointing at her and whispering among themselves. Some even approached to thank her again for her handling of the situation. What Olivia didn't know was that one of the passengers, a young social media influencer, had recorded much of the incident on the plane and uploaded it to the internet as soon as the plane landed. The video was going viral at an alarming rate. Meanwhile, David Anderson, still shaken by the events of the flight, sat in one of the airport cafeterias, trying to process everything that had happened. It was then that he noticed several people looking at him and murmuring. With a sinking feeling in his stomach, he took out his phone and saw that he was trending on social media. The video of the incident had gone viral, and he was the villain of the story. Olivia, unaware of this development, headed towards the airport exit, where an official car was waiting for her. Just as she was about to get into the vehicle, a local reporter approached her with a microphone. "Detective Johnson," said the reporter, almost breathless from the run. "Your handling of the situation on Flight 217 has gone viral. Do you have any comment on what happened?" Olivia, surprised by the question, took a moment to respond. "I'm sorry, but I can't comment at this time," she said finally, quickly getting into the car. As the vehicle drove away from the airport, Olivia took out her phone and saw an avalanche of notifications. The flight incident had become a media sensation, with headlines proclaiming her as an example of professionalism and empathy in times of racial tension. Her phone rang. It was her superior. "Johnson," said the voice on the other end of the line, "we have a problem. Your face is all over the news. The mission has been compromised." Olivia felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. All her preparation, all the work she had done to get to this point, was crumbling due to an unexpected incident on a flight. "Sir, Thaismundi," she began, but her superior interrupted her. "It's not your fault, Johnson. You handled the situation the best you could, but now we have to adapt. Come back to headquarters. We need to rethink the entire operation." Meanwhile, at the airport, David was facing his own consequences. His phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from journalists wanting his side of the story. His employer had contacted him. Olivia couldn't stop thinking about how a simple flight had derailed months of meticulous planning. Her phone wouldn't stop vibrating with notifications, but she ignored it, focusing on what she would say to her superior when she arrived. At the same time, at the airport, David Anderson found himself in an increasingly desperate situation. The comments on social media were becoming increasingly hostile, and he had already received a call from his company's human resources, informing him that he was suspended until further notice. Sitting in a chair in the terminal, his head in his hands, David wondered how his life had changed so drastically in a matter of hours. It was then that a figure approached him. It was an older woman, about 60, with a kind but determined face. "Mr. Anderson?" she asked softly. David looked up, surprised. "Yes," he responded with a trembling voice. "My name is Dr. Sarah Miller. I'm a psychologist specializing in trauma and implicit biases. I saw what happened on the flight and, well, I think I could help you." David looked at her with a mixture of surprise and distrust. "Why would you want to help me? I'm the villain of this story, remember?" Dr. Miller smiled compassionately. "I don't believe in villains, Mr. Anderson. I believe in people who make mistakes and in everyone's capacity to learn and grow. Would you like to have a coffee and talk?" Meanwhile, Olivia was arriving at police headquarters. The building was in an unusual state of agitation, with officers and staff running back and forth. When she entered her superior's office, Captain Thompson, she was surprised to see that he wasn't alone. With him was a woman Olivia immediately recognized, the district attorney, Jennifer Martinez. "Detective Johnson," said Captain Thompson, in a tone Olivia couldn't decipher. "Please, sit down." Olivia sat down, preparing for the worst. Were they going to take her off the case, suspend her, something worse? "Detective," began District Attorney Martinez, "what happened on that flight has had repercussions that no one could have predicted, but it has also given us a unique opportunity." Olivia blinked, confused. "Opportunity?" she asked. Captain Thompson nodded. "The case you've been working on, the human trafficking network. Well, it turns out your little moment of fame has given us an unexpected advantage." District Attorney Martinez continued. "Several key witnesses, who were previously afraid to speak, have contacted us. Your handling of the situation on the flight has given them confidence that they will be treated fairly by the authorities." Olivia was speechless for a moment. "But what about my cover? I thought the mission was compromised." "It is," confirmed Captain Thompson. "But we've decided to change our strategy. Instead of an undercover operation, we want you to be the public face of this investigation. Your current popularity could be just what we need to gain the community's trust and obtain more information." As Olivia processed this information, her phone vibrated once more. It was a message from an unknown number. "Detective Johnson, this is Dr. Sarah Miller. I'm with David Anderson. He wants to talk to you. I think this could be an opportunity for something important." Olivia looked at the message, then at her superiors. "I think," she said slowly, "I just received another unexpected piece of the puzzle." On the other side of the city, David and Dr. Miller were sitting in a quiet cafe. David had just finished telling his story, his fears, his prejudices that he didn't even know he had. "You know," said Dr. Miller, "what happened on that plane is a microcosm of what's happening in our society, but it also shows us that change is possible. And you, Mr. Anderson, now have a unique opportunity to be part of that change." David looked at her, a spark of hope shining in his eyes for the first time in hours. "How?" he asked. "Well," Dr. Miller smiled, "how would you feel about working with me and Detective Johnson on an implicit bias awareness program? Your experience, combined with Detective Johnson's perspective, could be incredibly powerful." At that moment, Dr. Miller's phone rang. It was a message from Olivia. "I'm interested in talking. Can we meet?" Dr. Miller smiled at David. "I think," she said, "we're about to start something important." Meanwhile, at police headquarters, Olivia was preparing for an impromptu press conference. Her life had taken a 180-degree turn in a matter of hours, but for the first time in a long time, she felt she was exactly where she needed to be. The human trafficking case, the incident on the plane, David Anderson, Dr. Miller. All these seemingly disparate pieces were starting to fit together into a larger puzzle, a puzzle that, Olivia hoped, could lead to real and lasting change. As she headed towards the conference room, Olivia took a deep breath. She didn't know exactly what the future held for her, but she was ready to face it. After all, as she had demonstrated on Flight 217, sometimes the most unexpected situations can lead to the most surprising and positive outcomes. The days following the Flight 217 incident were a whirlwind of activity for Olivia. Between press conferences, meetings with her superiors, and planning the new strategy for the human trafficking case, she barely had time to process everything that was happening. However, in the midst of all this chaos, Olivia couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Miller's message and David Anderson. Finally, 3 days after the flight, she managed to coordinate a meeting with them at a discreet cafe in downtown San Francisco. When Olivia arrived at the cafe, she saw David sitting at a table in the back, looking nervous and somewhat haggard. Dr. Miller was by his side, her presence seeming to give him some security. Olivia took a deep breath and approached the table. "Detective Johnson," said Dr. Miller, standing up to greet her. "Thank you for coming." David also stood up, but seemed unable to look Olivia in the eye. "Detective," he mumbled, I'm so sorry for everything." Olivia looked at both of them and then sat down. "Mr. Anderson," she said in a firm but not hostile voice, "I appreciate your apology. But I believe we're here to talk about something more than that, right?" Dr. Miller nodded. "That's right. Detective Johnson, we've been talking about how to turn this incident into something positive. David has been working with me on understanding his implicit biases and how they affected his actions on the flight." David, finally, looked up. "I had never realized, never thought that I could be," he stammered, "racist." Olivia softly completed, "One that uses both of your experiences as a starting point. David sharing how his biases led him to act the way he did, and you, detective, showing how to handle high-tension situations with empathy and professionalism." Olivia considered the proposal for a moment. "It's an interesting idea," she said slowly, "but how does this align with my current work? I'm in the middle of an important investigation." It was then that David spoke, his voice firmer than it had been throughout the conversation. "Detective Johnson, I know you probably think I'm the last person who should be involved in something like this, but since all this happened, I've been receiving messages from people who saw themselves reflected in me, who recognized their own prejudices in my actions. I think we could make a real difference." Olivia looked at David, seeing for the first time not the scared and paranoid man from the plane, but someone genuinely remorseful and willing to change. Then she looked at Dr. Miller, whose expertise in the field was evident. Finally, Olivia made a decision. "Okay," she said, "I'm willing to try it, but with one condition." "What's that?" David and Dr. Miller asked in unison. "I want to link this program to my current investigation into human trafficking. I believe prejudices and mistrust are part of what allows these crimes to continue. If we can address that, maybe we can make an even bigger change." Dr. Miller smiled broadly. "It's a brilliant idea, Detective. I think we can make it work." David nodded vigorously. "I'll do whatever it takes to help," he said. As the three began to discuss the details of their new collaboration, Olivia felt a wave of hope. What had begun as a tense and potentially disastrous flight was turning into an opportunity for real and meaningful change. Outside the cafe, the city of San Francisco bustled with activity, unaware of the conversation taking place inside. But soon, very soon, the effects of this meeting would be felt far beyond the walls of this small establishment. Flight 217 had been just the beginning. Now, Olivia, David, and Dr. Miller were about to embark on a much longer and more significant journey, a journey that, they hoped, could help heal some of society's deepest divisions. The following months were a whirlwind of activity for Olivia, David, and Dr. Miller. The implicit bias awareness program, which they called Bridges of Understanding, quickly began to take shape. Olivia, using her connections in the police department and her newly acquired fame, managed to secure funds and institutional support for the program. David Zalos, for his part, became the public face of personal transformation, openly sharing his experience and learning process. Dr. Miller was instrumental in designing the curriculum, ensuring that the program was not only effective but also based on solid scientific evidence. The first pilot workshop was held 6 months after the Flight 217 incident. It was a small event, with only 20 participants, but the impact was immediate and profound. Olivia began the session by sharing her experience on the flight, talking about how it felt to be the object of suspicion and prejudice. Her account was powerful and emotional, leaving many participants visibly moved. Then, David took the stage. With a trembling voice at first, but gaining strength as he went on, he shared his side of the story. He talked about his fears, his unconscious prejudices, and how these led him to act in a way that he now recognized as completely unacceptable. "I thought I was a good person," David said, his voice breaking slightly. "But that day on the plane, I realized I had layers of prejudice that I didn't even know existed, and that terrified me. But it also made me want to change, to be better." Dr. Miller closed the session with a presentation on the science behind implicit biases, offering practical strategies for recognizing and combating them in daily life. The impact of the workshop was immediate. Participants left moved and motivated, many of them committing to bring what they had learned to their own communities and workplaces. But the real turning point came a few weeks later, when a video of the workshop went viral on social media. The story of Olivia and David, their initial conflict and subsequent collaboration, captured the public's imagination. Soon, Dr. Bridges of Understanding was receiving requests from all over the country. Schools, businesses, police departments, everyone wanted to be part of this innovative initiative. Olivia, meanwhile, hadn't forgotten her original investigation into the human trafficking network. In fact, the program had become an unexpected but valuable tool in her fight against this crime. Through the workshops, Olivia was able to establish connections with communities that were previously reluctant to trust the police. The Bridges of Understanding program became a literal bridge between law enforcement and marginalized communities that were often targets of human trafficking networks. One day, after a particularly emotional workshop at a community center in San Francisco's Tenderloin district, a young woman approached Olivia with tears in her eyes. The girl told her about a friend who had disappeared months ago. Until that moment, she hadn't trusted the police enough to report it. This information turned out to be crucial. With the help of the community, now more willing to collaborate, Olivia and her team were able to unravel a significant part of the trafficking network they had been investigating for so long. Meanwhile, David had found a new purpose in life. From being a self-centered corporate executive, he had become a passionate advocate for social change. He traveled across the country, sharing his story and encouraging others to face their own prejudices. Dr. Miller, for her part, was amazed by the program's impact. What had begun as an idea born from a tense situation had become a national movement. She was receiving requests from universities to study the program and its effectiveness. A year after the Flight 217 incident, Olivia, David, and Dr. Miller were invited to give a TED Talk. Standing together on the iconic red stage, the three reflected on their unlikely journey. "A year ago, Olivia began, "we were strangers on a plane, divided by fear and prejudice. Today, we stand here as partners, and, I dare say, as friends." David nodded, taking the microphone. "I never imagined that the worst mistake of my life would lead me to my greatest purpose. Every day I wake up grateful for the opportunity to do something good, to try to repair the damage I caused." Dr. Miller closed the presentation with a note of hope. "What we've seen this year is that change is possible, that we can overcome our prejudices, that we can build bridges where there were once walls, but it requires courage, it requires vulnerability, and it requires the willingness to do the hard work of looking at ourselves honestly." The talk received a standing ovation and soon became one of the most viewed in TED history. But for Olivia, the real success wasn't in the applause or the fame. It was in the faces of the people who had been helped by the program. It was in the lives that had been saved thanks to renewed trust between the police and communities. It was in the human trafficking network that had finally been dismantled, thanks in large part to community collaboration. One night, as Olivia was preparing for another workshop, she received a text message from David. It was a photo of him holding a newborn baby. The message read, "Meet my granddaughter, Olivia, named after the woman who taught me the true meaning of justice and compassion." Olivia felt a lump form in her throat. She thought about that day on the plane, how she had been on the verge of losing patience, of reacting with anger to David's accusations. But she had chosen empathy, understanding, and that choice had triggered a series of events that had changed not only their lives, but the lives of thousands of people. As she put away her phone and headed to the stage to begin another workshop, Olivia realized that Flight 217 hadn't been the end of something, but the beginning of a journey that, she hoped, would continue for many years to come. 5 years had passed since that fateful Flight 217, and the impact of Bridges of Understanding had spread far beyond what Olivia, David, or Dr. Miller could have imagined. The program had become a national model for police reform and community trust building. Police departments across the country had adopted adapted versions of the program, and the results were undeniable. A decrease in incidents of racial discrimination, an increase in community trust in the police, and a significant improvement in case resolution thanks to greater citizen cooperation. Olivia Koo, now Captain Johnson, led a special unit dedicated to combating human trafficking and other crimes that disproportionately affected marginalized communities. Her approach, which combined law enforcement with community relationship building, had become a case study in police academies across the country. David Dunn, for his part, had left his corporate career to dedicate himself full-time to social activism. He had founded a non-profit organization dedicated to promoting racial equity and social justice in the workplace. His personal transformation continued to inspire thousands of people to face their own prejudices and actively work to overcome them. Dr. Miller had expanded her research and now led a center for studies on implicit biases and interracial relations at a prestigious university. Her work was helping to shape public policies and corporate practices across the country. On a sunny spring morning, the three met at the same cafe where they had first planned Bridges of Understanding. They were there to discuss the future of the program and reflect on the path they had traveled. "Can you believe all this started with a misunderstanding on a plane?" David said, smiling as he stirred his coffee. Olivia nodded, a reflective smile on her face. "Sometimes I think about how it would have been if things had gone differently that day, if we had let fear and mistrust win." "But we didn't," Dr. Miller interjected. "And that's the most important lesson we can teach, that we always have a choice. We can choose fear or understanding, division or unity." As they talked, a young woman timidly approached their table. "Excuse me," she said. "I couldn't help but overhear. You're the ones from the Bridges of Understanding program, aren't you?" The three nodded, and the young woman continued, I wanted to thank you. Your program changed my family's life. My brother, he was involved in some shady business. But after attending one of your workshops, he decided to change his life. Now he's in college, studying social work." Olivia, David, and Dr. Miller exchanged moved glances. It was a powerful reminder of why they did this work, of the lives they were touching. After the young woman left, the three sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their thoughts. Finally, Olivia spoke. "You know, when I became a detective, I thought my job was to catch the bad guys. But now I realize it's much more than that. It's about building bridges, creating understanding, about seeing the humanity in everyone. Even those who fear or misunderstand us," David nodded. "And for me, it's about recognizing that change is possible, that we're not condemned to repeat the mistakes of the past, that we can grow, learn, be better." Dr. Miller smiled. "And for me, it's about the science of hope, of understanding that our brains can change, that our hearts can open. That prejudice is not our destiny, but a challenge we can overcome." As the morning sun bathed the city of San Francisco, the three friends raised their cups in a silent toast for the path traveled, for the lives changed, and for the work that still remained to be done. Outside, the city bustled with activity. People of all races and backgrounds crossed paths in the streets, each with their own story, their own prejudices, their own struggles. But thanks to the work of Olivia, David, and Dr. Miller, many of those people now had the tools to see each other with greater empathy and understanding. Flight 217 had been just the beginning. The real journey, the journey towards a more just and understanding society, continued. And although the road ahead was still long, Olivia, David, and Dr. Miller knew that each step, each difficult conversation, each prejudice faced, brought them a little closer to that destination. As they left the cafe and headed towards their respective commitments for the day, the three shared a look of determination and hope. The work continued, and they were ready to face the challenges that would come, because in the end, they had learned the most important lesson of all, that real change begins with a single act of understanding, a single bridge built between two people who were previously divided by fear and mistrust. And with that lesson in their hearts, Olivia, David, and Dr. Miller ventured into the bustling city, ready to continue building bridges one at a time,